Thank you, everyone, for being here. Everybody can hear me well? Yes. Okay. Sorry that you're all starving, but hopefully. And I'm eager to see how you all coordinate in passing those pizzas around as I'm talking. So thank you for being here. I'm very excited about presenting this paper. I'm going to tell you, this is very much work in progress. I'm going to present you a first round of analysis of what I'll be talking about. So I'm very eager to receive comments, suggestions, what is convincing, what is not convincing. So I'm very eager to hear about your thoughts. As been said, I'll be talking about reproductive labor and the structure of inequality. And let me tell you what is the main motivation or intuition that is driving me to do this analysis. My main intuition is that I want to show how the way in which we structure reproduction, and by that I mean who takes care of the kids, who takes care of the elderly, who is cleaning houses, how we organize all that labor is actually an invisible and often forgotten major piece of the structure of inequality. Not just the structure of inequality between men and women, which is typically how we think that reproductive labor or household labor or care labor matters, but actually also for the structure of inequality across families and across individuals. This is kind of like the bigger picture argument that I want to convince you of, or kind of like the intuition also that drives my interest. We're very used to think about how the organization of productive labor, right, firms and minimum wage and the employers and collective bargaining, how that shapes the structure of inequality across individuals, but we're not so much used to thinking about how the organization of reproductive labor also constitutes a foundation for the structure of inequality. Again, this is the broader motivation. The case that I'll tell you about to convince you about this argument is the case of childcare costs. So if you are a parent, have friends who are a parent, or you read the news, you will know that childcare is very, very expensive, and it has been gotten more expensive over the recent years. In some cases, as the Washington Post was reporting, the cost of childcare is basically very similar to the cost of in-state college tuition in many of the states across the US. And we should consider that these costs are coming at a very different point in the life course compared to college tuition, right? When parents need to pay for college tuition, they are older adults, they have had time to save up for college of their kids, right? And their kids can also even contribute to the payment of the college. When they have a newborn, the newborn cannot pay itself to childcare. They are much younger. They haven't had time to really save up for that. So it's a gigantic cost that is coming at a very different time in the life course that can have a pretty impact on the household economies. So childcare cost is very expensive. It has been growing more expensive. Here's another infographic. This is coming from Childcare Aware organization. That is a policy advocacy group that is doing some basically dissemination of the data on childcare costs. This map is showing childcare costs as a proportion of minimum wage jobs. So in Pennsylvania, and I should have put you the example for New Jersey, but we're neighbors. In Pennsylvania, if you are a full-time, year-round minimum wage worker, you would be, and you receive no subsidies. Like subsidies is a different question, but if you had no access to subsidies for childcare, you would be basically expected to pay 70% of your minimum wage, basically 70% of your annual earnings to cover for full-time childcare. This is using the average at the state level. So it's a gigantic cost. And what you see in this infographic is that we have pretty strong variation in the cost of childcare as a proportion of minimum wage annual earnings across the United States. On the West Coast, it seems to be a little bit more cheaper. So the South also cheaper. On the East Coast is where it's more expensive. And the graph at the bottom just shows you a little bit kind of like the average at the country level, how it has changed since the 1980s. It almost doubled from 83.3, which is like weekly cost, to 143. So childcare is expensive. It's coming at a very inconvenient, let's say, time in the life course. It has been growing more expensive, and there is cross-regional variation in the US in the cost of childcare. So I want to pose this question related to childcare, which is basically childcare. I like to say that childcare poses this dilemma, and this dilemma is that if you are one of these minimum wage workers and childcare eats up basically half of your earnings that you will be earning on the market, does it pay off to work? Like, is it worth it, right? Like, does it pay off to be a full-time worker and have your newborn in a full-time daycare for basically your net earnings are basically half of what you're making in the market? Does it really pay off? So, and this question, I think, is important for understanding the decisions that mothers and parents are making when they have newborns, but I also want to make the case that this question is helping us rethink our models of employment. What do I mean by that? We have two basic theoretical, let's say, models to understand women's decisions about employment, particularly around the time of first birth or time of motherhood. And I don't know if I'm going too fast. Okay. And these two main models, and you've seen these written over and over again in different papers probably, is the idea of income need and opportunity cost, right? The income need is basically the perspective that says women would be expected to remain employed in the labor market or to remain employed after the birth of a child whenever there is a need for extra income in the household, right? So whenever households are struggling to make ends meet and there is need for extra income, women will be expected to remain in the labor market. So from this perspective, one would expect women in low-income families to be more likely to remain employed after a new birth than women in higher-income households. The other idea is basically the opposite, right, which is a much more dominant perspective nowadays, is the idea of opportunity cost, which is that the more you can earn by being employed in the market, the higher your earnings potential, basically, the more likely you will be to remain employed after a new birth because you're losing more by staying out. Your opportunity cost, what you're losing by staying out of the market is higher, so you will be expected to remain. So from this perspective, from the opportunity cost perspective, we expect women with higher earnings potential, and here I'll be talking about the proxy of women with a college degree or more, for instance, to be more likely to remain employed after a birth of a new child than women with lower level of education with lower earnings potential. There's, many papers that try to evaluate whether income need or opportunity costs dominate, and basically the consensus nowadays is that opportunity cost dominates as an effect, right? The idea that it is over and over again, empirical data is showing that women with higher earnings potential are more likely to remain in the labor market after new births. They have a stronger attachment to the market, basically. And the justification for it is that the opportunity cost is just higher, so they gain more by staying in. So neither of these approaches consider at all the cost of childcare. And I think that this is the product of, just how invisible reproductive labor in general is in a lot of these theories about economic stratification that do not deal with gender, basically. So my intervention here is that I think we should incorporate centrally the idea of replacement costs. And the idea of replacement costs is basically, what does it cost to free your labor to be commodified, basically? What does it cost for you to open up your time to be able to be employed in the market? So in this case, is the cost of substituting your own unpaid labor, the cost of substituting your own unpaid labor. Let's think about you're a couple or you're a single individual, you're having a newborn, and if you have a parent or some kin that can take care of that newborn and doesn't ask for any money in exchange for that, then your replacement cost will be zero, right? There will be no cost for you to free your labor and to be available for full-time employment. But if there is nobody around you who can take the care of this newborn for free, right? You don't have a parent, you don't have a partner who can do that, then you might have to hire somebody else to do it. And the cost of hiring somebody else to do it is your replacement cost. So the replacement cost gives us, and if we put it in relationship to the opportunity cost, we can think about the idea of commodification return. Basically, where are my returns to commodifying my labor, to freeing up my time to be employed? So let's say if we divide, so this concept of commodification return basically calculates this net return to being employed once I discount how much do I need to pay for replacing the reproductive labor, right? We can think about the full-time housewives as being this, this replacement, basically keeping husbands' replacement costs at zero, right? Because wives, full-time wives were basically taking care of these children for no pay at all and basically making available men for full-time employment. So basically keeping men's reproductive costs to zero. But once women are entering the labor market, then they either need to hire it out and the replacement costs start to be relevant. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Okay, so I want to talk about this idea of commodification return, which is the ratio between opportunity costs and replacement costs. Here is a walking example. I forgot it. Okay, so let me show you how this matters for the decision of employment that women make when they have a newborn. Okay, so here we have two women. We have Maria and Sonia, and we have that they're working in exactly the same company. They have exactly the same full-time 4-year jobs, and they make the same money, $50,000 per year. Okay, but they live in different states. One lives in Alabama, the other one in Pennsylvania. As a result of that, they have different childcare costs. They face different childcare costs. In Alabama, $10,000 per year. In Pennsylvania, $20,000 per year. This results in very different commodification returns for these two women. We have Maria has a commodification return of 5, and Sonia 2.5. According to this model, we would expect Sonia to be much less likely to remain employed after birth than Maria, right? Because what she gains from being full-time employed is what Sonia gains from being a full-time employed person is lower than what Maria does because of the difference in replacement costs. Okay, so let's go back to kind of the argument that I want to be making today, which is this idea that replacement costs are a driver of inequality among women and across households. And here, childcare cost is just one type of replacement of reproductive. Childcare costs are one type of replacement cost. And the actual empirical hypothesis, what I want to test to show you and to convince you of this argument, what I want to show you is that childcare costs will basically affect women's post-birth employment negatively, right? It will reduce in general women's post-birth employment, but they will reduce it more strongly for women with low earnings potential than for women with high earnings potential. And the result of that will be that when childcare costs are expensive, the gap among women between the low earning and the high earning potential women will be growing after a birth. And when childcare costs are cheap, the difference in the post-employment trajectories of high earning and low earning women will be much narrower, will be more equal. And I'll show you that as a result of this growing gap in women's post-birth employment that is produced by childcare, household earnings inequality will also increase. Yeah, I should have said at the beginning that I'm welcome to take clarification questions, and then we'll leave discussion questions towards the end. You have a question to say?
So I was wondering how you're thinking about, and you can hold
Yeah.
on this if you want, childcare quality. So is that $10,000 giving you the same quality as the $20,000?
Yes, excellent question. So this is one of the directions in which I'm planning to move it. So in this case, for at this stage of the paper, I only have costs. But I'm planning to include data on the availability. So we don't know even like if there may be an issue of availability, and then definitely of quality. So that's not in the data at the moment, but definitely very relevant to consider, because then that will affect also the decision of whether to outsource it to. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, did you say why you're using the ratio of income to childcare costs as opposed to the difference?
I don't have a specific argument for doing a difference versus the ratio. I think it's a way of illustrating the idea. I'm actually not going to use that even in the analysis. I'm using it to illustrate the idea that reproductive costs basically change your gain from the market. Yeah. Yes.
So this is to follow up on Quinn's comment, but so you're assuming that a college-educated woman would pay the same cost as she might want to replace herself would cost more?
Definitely, excellent question as well. Yes. So there is variation in childcare costs. Like not all the childcare centers in Pennsylvania cost the same. People look for the highest quality one, especially if you can afford it. You can even afford the living nanny if you want basically that kind of replacement for the mother kind of like type of care, right? So there is a variety of childcare costs. There's only not a single one. I guess I'll think more about how I can incorporate that in the analysis. It is not there yet now, but one can think basically creating a gradient where the childcare costs vary a little bit depending on the income in a way. But yeah, but it's not there yet. Yes.
In your previous working example of the two people, do you factor into the opportunity cost of their employment in this calculus? Because I'm struggling with why you need this term replacement cost when I see it's just between the two regimes, it's just the price effect and the income effect, right? Like
yes.
One is costly because the child care institution or the service are costly, but in another case, by quitting my job to do childcare full time, my opportunity costs could be even higher. So just by using price effect and how you substitute between the two types of childcare arrangement, I think it's kind of sufficient to tell the story already. So can like, what's the benefit of using this commodification return or replacement cost in this case?
I mean, in this case, I'm trying to make a conceptual point about the price effect of reproductive labor. In this case, it's just like a different term on basically your returns from being employed. So it's more I'm using the concepts more for making the conceptual point and for attaching what you're calling the price effect to the activity that I'm trying to draw attention to than for a different reason. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on, and I'm happy to set. So this is the hypothesis that I was at, and this is what I want to show you. Before I'm going to start showing you the results from the analysis, let's assess whether this argument is feasible or not. Like this is an intuition, I have this intuition, and it's like, okay, how likely it is that childcare costs of all things will actually have a sizable enough impact that will shape inequality, okay? The first thing that I would want to know to see if this argument is feasible or not, I would want to know if inequality increases with new births, right? If inequality across households doesn't increase with the new birth, there is very little chance that my argument has any traction or any relevance whatsoever. So this is the first thing that I want to do. I'll show you a couple of graphs now before I'm actually telling you the data, but this is the same data that I'll be using for the analysis. It's coming from the SIP, the Survey of Income and Program Participation. Okay, so does inequality increase with new births? Here I'm showing you a quick graph, descriptive graph to get at this idea. What we see here on the y-axis is the coefficient of variation, which is a measure of inequality. This is household earnings. And what you see on the x-axis is months or time since first birth. The graph starts 2 years before a new birth. The middle of the graph is the month of the first birth. And the graph ends at 2 years after the first birth, okay? And this is a sample of households that experience a new birth during the survey, okay? So we have households that do not have any birth at the beginning of the survey and that they will experience a birth during the survey. So what do we see here? We see a pretty impressive, actually, effect of new birth on the inequality across this sample of households, right? We see that the coefficient of variation kind of like starts growing already in the year, or like particularly in the month preceding the first birth. It peaks at 0, which is when the household experiences the new birth. Then it goes down a little bit, but then remains much higher than the levels at which it started, right? And if you want to know the relevance between the difference in inequality across this sample of households, 2 years before birth and 2 years after birth, this jump in inequality is kind of equivalent to basically half of the inequality, half of the increase in inequality that all households in the US experienced since the 1980s. So it is a pretty substantial increase in inequality that we observe around the first birth, okay? So again, I'm encouraged. Let's see if this can go through. So what else would I want to know to assess whether my argument is feasible or not? I've shown you, hopefully, that actually inequality does increase with first births. But for my argument to be true, this inequality, this increasing inequality, should be driven by what women are doing, because my whole story is about women's changes in employment and generally labor supply around first birth and how that changes the earnings of these households in which they live in, okay? So if this change in inequality that I observe has nothing to do with women's employment, we can imagine that, I don't know, men might be doing a bunch of overtime hours while they're having their first birth, and these could be increasing inequality, right? It doesn't necessarily have to do with women. So I want to see how likely it is that this has to do with women. So what do? I basically fix women's pre-birth earnings, and whenever I see them dropping out of the labor market, I'm imputing them the last earnings that we observed for them. So I'm just faking, producing a fake trend that we would observe if none of these women were dropping out of the labor market at all, and then I'm going to recalculate the inequality trend, okay? So what if women maintain their pre-birth earnings? This is just sort of like a quick kind of check. What do we see? We see that basically the entire sort of like change in inequality across these households associated with the event of new birth is basically driven by changes in women's labor supply, by changes in women's employment. Because if women maintained their pre-birth earnings, if we sort of like fake impute them, their pre-birth earnings, basically the trend in inequality is flat. Okay? So this is encouraging. This is like, okay, these were the two kind of like things that I needed to check to basically convince myself that it was worth it to go down the data and like look for data on childcare costs and sort of like conduct the analysis, right? Okay. Back to you already know the hypothesis, you've already memorized this. Okay, so what I'm going to show you a series of multi-level regression models that basically exploit the cross-regional variation in the US in childcare costs to identify whether childcare costs are actually driving some of these employment changes that women do right after birth that I showed you play a very key role in changing inequality across these households in this window. So I'll show you these multi-level regression models, and then I'll show you a counterfactual simulation that I've conducted basically to capture the effect of childcare costs on the shape of inequality. Okay? So the counterfactual simulation that I'll present you today is this idea like how would household inequality change if childcare was free? So I'm going to impute them 0 cost for childcare, as if like all these women had also wives themselves. And I'll look at that. In the future, I have a plan to actually do different simulations with like different kinds of costs, etc. Okay, but today I'm just like giving you the crude early run results. So what am I using? I'm using the survey of income and program participation. For those of you probably know already this data. It's a rotating panel that started in 1984, and it has this series of different panels. It's excellent because it has a lot of information about the different kind of income components. The survey was actually designed to track program participation, meaning people who receive some kind of welfare transfer. Sorry for the misleading advertisement on my title, because the results that I'll show you today actually use only the last two panels, 2004 and 2008. I have the ambition of using the entire thing, but I haven't gotten there yet. So, so this is going to be recent data. We have monthly information, so this is why I can show you the graph at the month sort of like level for the effect of first birth on inequality. Households are followed every 4 months for up to 5 years. And the sample that I'll be working with today is partnered women at risk of first birth. They may be married or not, I don't care. They are at the beginning of the household, at the beginning of the panel. They need to be within an age range, basically 16 to 45. They need to have a partner, and then they need to experience they need to be childless, and then they need to experience a first birth during the course of the panel. These are my sample conditions. The measures that I'll be using, so for the dependent variable, I'll use the employment and the hours, her employment and her hours. My key independent variable here will be this childcare cost, which is a single estimate, unfortunately, at the state level. I'm hoping to do a lot more to capture the different dimensions of just the dispersion of childcare costs within the states, for instance, and the quality of childcare costs, the availability of childcare costs. So I'm hoping to do a lot more on that end very soon. Then I'm using her education as a proxy for earnings potential. And here I'm just going to use the three classic groups: high school or less, some college, and college. Then I'm going to use controls for social demographic variables and for state level economic variables as well. I'm using the state level, for instance, women's employment, gender wage gap, and also GDP, for instance, to sort of like try to control for some of the covariance between childcare costs and economic conditions at the state level. Method, it's a multi-level model with basically random intercepts at the person and at the state level. So basically we're clustering the error at the person level, and then we're nesting these persons into states. Here you have the basic equation. The main thing that I want to tell you, we have the dependent variable, which will be employment and hours. And then the key variable, the key idea here is this three-way interaction, which is a cross-level interaction between a timer for before and after birth, which is this T. It's not exactly before and after birth. It actually has 4 categories. So it has before birth will be the baseline, and then the time of birth would be the first category, and then about half a year after birth, and then like the second year after birth, basically. So it's a counter for the time since birth. And then we have the education, which is its proxy for her earnings potential. And then we have the childcare cost, which only varies across the states, doesn't vary across individuals within states. So this three-way interaction is testing the idea that childcare costs should affect the post-birth employment trajectories of high and low earning women differently. It should affect basically the post-employment trajectories of low earning women more strongly, more negatively than it should affect the employment trajectories of high earning women. This is the basic idea that we want to test with this interaction. Very quickly, just descriptive statistics. This is just to show you we have this person month data set. For these two different panels, we have the amounts to about 800 persons, sort of like 800 women that are going through the first birth during the SIP. This is just the proportion employed and sort of like the age and the childcare cost on average. I'll show you a couple of graphs for the descriptive just to get a sense, like to give you basically the shape of the data and so that you can interpret the results more easily. This is the proportion employed on the y-axis. And again, x-axis is the time since birth. So we have, again, 2 years before birth, and then in the middle we have the month of birth, and then we end with the 2 years after birth. And we have the 3 groups that we'll be working with, which is the low-earning women, middle-earning women, and high-earning, in this case, education, sorry. So high school or less, some college in the middle, and college or more in blue. So what do we see? We basically see that the month of birth have a big impact on employment for all the 3 groups of women, but it seems to have a stronger impact on the employment levels of high school or less women. So they drop more from the labor market at birth than the college educated do. And then the employment levels after sort of like remain, like there's this pretty flat line in the 2 years that follow the first birth. So this is the first dependent variable, employment. Second dependent variable, hours. And here we have a pretty similar shape. We have already a gradient in the fact that women with higher education work more already preceding the birth than women with lower education. As they go through the first birth, everybody is dropping. Like this, some college women seem to be dropping a lot more than these ones, and then the gradient remains after. Yeah.
Is this restricted to only employed women?
No. So the hours variable includes the zeros in this case. And there might be some reasons for actually doing the hours analysis without the zeros, if we want to capture something different. But so far, I've been including the non-employed in the hours. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So some regression coefficients analysis. So I'll show you some things. Now I'm showing you here some of the coefficients, and this is very difficult to read because it's a 3-way interaction. I'm only showing you some of the relevant coefficients, but I'll show you predicted estimates in just a second. So bear with me for a second. My main message with this slide is to show you that childcare costs at the baseline, that is in the year before birth, have no effect on women's employment levels, but this is the childcare cost. I should have changed them, so it's not. See, infant stands for childcare costs. 0, 1, 2, this is the time of first birth, 1 year and 2 years after the birth. So here's where we see the negative effect of childcare costs on all women as they, in their post-birth employment trajectories. And the 3-way interaction, what it shows us is that these women with higher levels of education than the baseline, which is the women with high school or less, because the negative effect of childcare seems to be kind of like offset. Okay, they seem to be less affected by this. So let me show you these in a show you some predicted values to give you this idea. What I've done here is, so these are predicted values in the scenario of 3 different scenarios of childcare costs. So this is a scenario like 1 standard deviation below the average childcare cost. So this is the cheap scenario, let's say. This is the average childcare cost. And this is the expensive childcare cost, 1 standard deviation above the average childcare cost in the United States. And what I'm plotting here are the employment trajectories after birth. So this is like the year before birth, 1 year after, and 2 years after for these 3 same groups of women. And the main thing here is to pay attention to what the high schoolers and some college are doing. And what we see basically is that the women with high school or less or some college are sensitive to the cost of childcare because their post-employment trajectories are changing with the cost of childcare. Whereas the women with a college degree, their employment trajectories post-birth are very similar across these 3 different scenarios. And what we see is that the gap among women is larger 2 years after birth in the expensive scenario than in the cheap scenario. Okay? So I'll show you now the results for, this is if I get rid of the some college group so that you can see the difference a little bit better. So here you see more clearly that there is this growing gap where here there is none. I'll show you now results for her hours. So here I'm changing the dependent variable and I'm looking at the hours instead of the employment, and the results are pretty similar. On the baseline, childcare costs make no difference. They make a difference basically after birth, negative effect. And then we see that this negative effect of childcare cost is kind of like almost turns positive, or has basically it's offset by the women with a college degree, and it's more negative for the some college women than the baseline, which is this high school or less. Yes?
On the prior figure, am I correct in interpreting that the more expensive childcare is, the higher the proportion of college-educated women will return to the workforce?
Because you're looking at the difference in the levels between here and here.
Or just, yeah, the absolute bill?
Yeah. Yes, I guess that is the correct interpretation of the graph. Yeah. The message that I wanna basically keep thinking about the differences, but that's correct. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So here the hours, kind of like a similar pattern. There's a pattern. The pattern is a little bit different for some college, but I can get at the details in the Q&A if you want. But I wanna go through the simulation. Here, these patterns here are not as clear as the previous ones, but basically the slope, especially for the some college, is clearly way more sensitive to the childcare cost than the slope of the more higher educated group. The basic pattern is similar. So basically the inequalities here are like tiny bit like larger than in the cheap childcare scenario. Okay. Okay, so summary so far, and I'm running out of time. So basically, hopefully I convinced you a little bit that childcare cost is associated with declines in post-birth labor supply for women, that the childcare costs actually reduce women's post-birth employment more strongly for these low-earning women than for high-earning women, and that these gaps in post-birth labor supply increase with childcare costs. Basically, where childcare is expensive, the gaps between like low-earning and high-earning women grow large with the new birth, and in places where childcare is not expensive, those gaps remain a bit narrower. Okay, so now I want to show you the inequality simulations, and here this is first run of the data. I've done basically like a quick way of doing this simulation to give you the main idea into. But I have a lot of ideas already on how to change this, and I welcome more ideas from you guys that you might have. What am I going to do? I'm going to predict inequality based on the regression model that I just estimated. Okay, and I'm going to show you how this predicted inequality compares to the observed inequality that I showed you at the beginning, to sort of like make sure, okay, the predicted inequality is kind of like a decent estimate for the observed inequality. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the regression coefficients to predict counterfactual hours to women. I'm going to give them what would be your hours of employment if childcare was free. Okay? So I'm going to give them counterfactual hours, and then I'm going to recalculate their earnings with these counterfactual hours. Okay? And I'm going to recalculate household earnings with women's counterfactual earnings. Are you following here? This is a kind of basic exercise. And then I'm going to predict counterfactual inequality based on that. So the key idea here is that the difference between the predicted inequality and the counterfactual inequality will give us a rough estimate of the contribution of childcare costs to inequality. Because the only thing that changes in this case is my basically manipulation of the data in like setting all childcare costs to 0. So this is the comparison of my predicted inequality and my observed inequality. This is a very similar graph to the one that you saw at the beginning with inequality. It's a little bit simplified because I'm using my model, the regression model that collapses some of these categories. But we basically have 1 year before birth, time of birth, 1 year after birth, 2 years after birth. And again, we have the CV, the coefficient of variation. The observed inequality is in green, so this is the increase that I presented before. and my predicted just using the model the regression model that I estimated. And I have this difference in the intercepts, which is like fine. I'm interested in the change, not so much in the intercept, so that's fine. And I overestimated a little bit. Like the change in inequality in the predicted trend is a little bit higher than in the observed trend, but it's not too bad. This doesn't look terrible, in my opinion. Okay, so what happens if I set everybody's childcare cost to 0? What would be the observed inequality that we would see? Okay, so this is what I'm getting at the moment, provisional results. So what I'm showing here is the change in inequality that would occur if everybody was experiencing 0 childcare costs. And what I see is that about 60% of the increase in inequality at birth can be accounted by the effect of childcare costs, which is the difference between the predicted and the counterfactual. If you want the numbers, here are the numbers. This is the change in inequality. Sorry, this is the inequality before birth, after birth, and this is the change in the observed trend, the simulated, and then my counterfactual 21, and basically 63% of the change in inequality at time of birth can be accounted by this, which is pretty substantial. So hopefully, here's a summary. I wanted to go through some of the limitations. I'll do it in a second. So hopefully I convinced you a little bit that childcare costs are associated with these declines, and that these childcare costs affect women's employment patterns for birth in a pretty substantial manner, and that these affecting women's employment patterns after birth actually changes the structure of inequality across families, not just across women, but actually across families. Okay. Is the magnitude of the effect large enough to make a difference? Like, this is a sample of only families that are going through the first birth. So is this going to be actually like big enough to matter in the entire population? There might be a reason to think that maybe not, because at every single point in time there is only a very small part of the population that is going through the first birth. And maybe these effects are temporary. Maybe they phase out, and like these women go back to the labor market, and sort of like basically the effect disappears. But I also think that there is a chance that the magnitude might be large enough, because even though only a small group of people at every single point in time is going through the first birth is actually experienced for many, many, many households. So it's a very frequent it's a very frequent experience. This is only first birth, but we can think about conducting the same analysis with second birth, with higher order birth. We can think about running this kind of analysis even for different kinds of events that generate care demands, like the disability onset of a relative, or the need for care of an aging parent or an elderly. These are also moments where there is kind of like a generation of care need that needs to be dealt with. So I think that there is a chance that the magnitude will be large enough. But like I said, I'm at the beginning of this project, and I plan to do a lot more, but I haven't done it yet today. What about non-partnered women? How would this, I'm using a sample here of partnered women. What if I include all the single women? How will childcare cost affect all these women? And the difference, I'm assuming, will be pretty substantial, because non-partnered women do not have partners' earnings to rely on. So maybe childcare costs affect them differently. Sort of the commodification return level at which one might decide might be different for these women, because they might have access to different. Okay, so these are some of the questions that I'm thinking about as I am going forward with this project. Limitations. So there's plenty of limitations in the analysis that I've shown you. One thing that I'm very satisfied with is the identification method. Using cross-regional variation to estimate, it's not perfect because it can correlate with a bunch of other things that I'm concerned about. The measurement is not great, so I have ideas of moving towards an experimental design, using explicit interventions in childcare costs to basically kind of pin down the very causal, precise effect of childcare costs on women's employment trajectories, and then use that estimate to basically extrapolate it in the larger population. planning to use some other data to get better information on childcare costs, childcare availability, quality of childcare, and you include data from earlier panels. So by closing, just wanted to remind you of this kind of like basic intuition that I've started with, which is this idea that we think a lot about how the organization of productive labor shapes inequality in a very direct way, and I want to encourage us to also think how the organization of reproductive labor also is a foundation of the structure of inequality. And I'll end it here. Thank you.